On a Sunday afternoon, I had just finished my morning coffee and was relaxing on the couch. My stepson Jake had been home for a week. He had just returned from his first year in college. While I was excited to see him, there was a feeling of unease. Jake was no longer the lanky teenager who used to raid the fridge at midnight or play video games until dawn. College had changed him. He was more confident and had filled out in ways that were hard not to notice. He reminded me of his father, my husband. But there was a youthful energy about him that made it hard to look away. Jake was standing in the hallway, naked except for a small towel. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stammered, "Jake, what are you doing?" My face burned with embarrassment, but I couldn't move. He said he'd forgotten his towel, but I saw something in his eyes that made me shiver. I turned away and went back to my room. My heart was racing and my hands felt clammy. What just happened? I told myself people forget their towels all the time, but Jake looked at me differently. I felt guilty. I shouldn't have been thinking about him like that. But I did. And it made me feel awkward. Jake acted like nothing had happened, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time he walked into the room, I felt my stomach twist. His easygoing demeanor made me question whether I was overthinking everything. Maybe I was the only one making this into a big deal. We ordered pizza for dinner. As we sat in the living room watching TV, the tension was palpable. At least to me. Jake laughed at the show, leaning back on the couch like he didn't have a care in the world. Jake turned to me and asked if I was okay. I lied, avoiding eye contact. Jake wasn't buying it. He asked if it had anything to do with earlier. I froze. My heart dropped into my stomach. He had noticed. I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, but my voice betrayed me. He said with a chuckle that he'd seen my face when he walked out of the bathroom and I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I felt my cheeks flush. It was unexpected. Let's not make this a thing. Jake raised his hands in mock surrender. He said he wasn't making it a thing, but he just thought it. I laughed to change the subject, but Jake didn't stop. He said, "You don't have to be so uptight around me." His words were harmless, but the way he said them made my pulse quicken. I nodded and went to the kitchen to get more water. I leaned against the counter and tried to calm down. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope. This wasn't just about the awkward bathroom incident. There was something else between us. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but the tension lingered. By the time I went to bed, I felt exhausted. I was trying to keep everything normal, but normal was the last thing I felt. Jake knocked on my bedroom door just before midnight. "Can I come in?" he asked. I said yes. He came in wearing a plain white t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked different, vulnerable. He said he couldn't sleep. He'd been thinking about things. I asked what. He said he didn't know. He was just thinking about life. "Coming home, you and Dad seemed different." His words caught me off guard. I didn't expect that. It made me feel guilty. "What do you mean different?" I asked. "I don't know. You're distant. You're keeping things bottled up." He paused, looking at me with intensity. "I just want you to. I'm here if you need to talk." His words were innocent, but the way he looked at me sent a wave of confusion through me. I wanted to believe this was just a heart-to-heart moment, but I knew there was more to it. "Thanks, Jake. That means a lot." We didn't say anything. The silence was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Jake left. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I didn't know what was happening, but something had shifted between us. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Jake and I both pretended like everything was normal. But there were subtle changes in how we interacted. A quick look, a long pause in conversation. It was all so subtle that anyone outside would have missed it. One morning, I was making coffee when Jake walked into the kitchen. He was wearing a hoodie and sweatpants, looking like the carefree college kid he was. To keep my tone light, he leaned against the counter, watching me as I poured my coffee. "You always get up this early." "Old habit. Your dad and I usually start the day around this time." Jake smiled, but there was something mischievous in his expression. "You and Dad do everything together?" I froze for a split second before forcing a laugh. "Well, that's kind of how marriage works." "Sure." His tone was teasing, but I don't think he looked at you the way you deserve. I didn't know how to respond. Was he just being playful or was there a deeper meaning? "Jake, don't worry about it. I said, trying to brush it off. He surrendered. You deserve better. He grabbed a coffee and left. I was left grappling with emotions. Later that evening we were watching TV. I thought the day's awkward moment had passed, but as the credits rolled, Jake turned to me with a thoughtful look on his face. He asked, "Ever feel like life doesn't turn out the way you thought?" I glanced at him, surprised by the question. "Why do you ask?" "I don't know. I guess coming home makes me think about how different things are now. We used to be so close when I was younger, but now it feels like there's this distance." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had always thought of myself as a good stepmom, but lately I hadn't been so sure. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been pulling away even before all this tension started. I never meant for us to drift apart. We thought we were drifting apart. I said softly, "It's just life gets complicated." Jake turned to look at me. His gaze was intense. "It doesn't have to be," we said at the same time. We just sat there staring at each other. The air between us fell. Then Jake leaned back and broke eye contact. "I think I'm going to head to bed," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "Good night," I said. I followed him upstairs. I sat there, my mind racing. I knew this was dangerous territory. I was the adult here, but I felt like I was losing control. The next morning started off quietly. I had thrown myself into chores, desperate for a distraction. Jake spent the day in his room. He spent most of the day in his room, only coming out for meals. It felt like we were avoiding each other. By the afternoon, I had convinced myself that everything would blow over if I just acted like nothing was wrong. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. At around 3 p.m., Jake appeared in the doorway of the laundry room. I was folding towels and the rhythmic motion kept me grounded. He asked for help, leaning against the door frame. I said I had it. He stepped inside, picking up a towel and folding it. He asked about dinner. I said I hadn't decided. He looked at me and said, "You've been weird." His voice was softer now. "Is it because of me?" I froze, the towel forgotten. "Why would it be because of you?" Jake stepped closer, overwhelming the small room. "I don't know," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "But I feel like there's something we're not talking about." His words hung in the air. I wanted to deny it, brush him off, but the truth was he was right. "Jake, I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking. He took another step closer, his face now only inches from mine. "I think you do," he said quietly. The room felt small, the air thick with tension. I could feel my pulse pounding as I stared at him, torn between every instinct and the magnetic pull. "Jake, this isn't..." I started. But my words stopped as he touched my hand. It was brief, but it sent a shock through me. I pulled my hand back, my breath catching. "This isn't right." Jake nodded slowly, his expression conflicted. "He said it, but that doesn't mean it's true." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. There was something there, something I had been trying to ignore, but I couldn't deny it. "I think you should go," I said finally, my voice trembling. Jake hesitated, then nodded. He said okay, his voice barely audible as he turned to leave. I felt a wave of relief mixed with an ache. I leaned against the counter, trying to calm down. I knew this wasn't the end. We had crossed a line. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came out. The house felt quieter than usual. Jake stayed in his room. I tried to focus on anything but him. My thoughts kept coming back to it. By the time night fell, I thought I'd made it through the day without incident. I was wrong. It was almost midnight when I heard a knock at my door. I knew who it was before I answered. I opened the door a crack to see Jake standing there. "What is it?" I asked. "I couldn't sleep," he said. I sighed. I was torn between letting him in and sending him back to his room. His vulnerable look won me over. Jake walked in and sat at the foot of the bed. He looked young and unsure. I asked what was on his mind. He hesitated, his hands fidgeting. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice shaky. "You don't have to," I said quickly, hoping to stop whatever was about to happen. "But I do," he insisted, looking up at me with eyes full of emotion. "I can't keep pretending like nothing's happening." My breath caught. There was out in the open. The one thing I'd been dreading. Jake was there. "Nothing's happening," I said, though my voice wavered. He shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "You can't believe that. I see the way you look at me, the way you avoid being alone with me. You feel it too, don't you?" I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. The truth was, he wasn't wrong. This wasn't right. I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He said, his tone softer. "But that doesn't mean it's not real for a moment." We sat in silence, the weight of his words between us. I felt like I was on a cliff, knowing one wrong step could ruin everything. "Jake, we can't do this," I said, looking him in the eye. "You're my stepson. This is wrong. I'm not a kid." He said quietly, "You're not happy." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right. I wasn't happy. My marriage had been on autopilot for years. I'd been too afraid to admit it even to myself. But that didn't make this okay. "I need you to leave." He meant it, but when I didn't waver, he left. I was alone with my thoughts. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. This was a turning point. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were a tangled web of guilt and confusion. I had questions I didn't want to answer. The house was silent, but I could still hear Jake's words. "You're not happy." I didn't want to admit how true that was. My marriage hadn't been happy for years. My husband and I had grown distant, our conversations shallow, and our affection routine. But that didn't justify what had almost happened tonight. I knew I had to address this before it got worse. I couldn't risk another. The next morning, Jake came downstairs for breakfast. The tension was there, but I avoided his eyes. We moved around the kitchen like strangers. I finally couldn't take it anymore. I told him we needed to talk. He nodded. We sat at the kitchen table. The sunlight was a stark contrast to the heaviness of the moment. I began struggling to find the right words. Jake looked down at his hands, his jaw tight. "I know," he said quietly, "I care about you." "Jake," I continued, "you're my family and I can't betray your father like this." He looked up at me, then his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "I wasn't trying to ruin anything. I just don't know what I was thinking." "I know," I said, reaching across the table to place a hand over his. "We all make mistakes, but this is a line we can't cross." Jake nodded and smiled. "I get it. I'm sorry for putting you in that position." I felt a sense of, we both knew we could move past this if we worked at it. The days that followed were awkward but manageable. We both made an effort to return to normal. The tension began to fade. Jake seemed to throw himself into preparing for college. I focused on reconnecting with my husband. The incident left a mark on both of us. It also served as a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call for me. It was a reminder to address my marriage issues. For Jake, it was a lesson in boundaries and healthy emotion management. We moved forward without letting temptation define our relationship. It wasn't a happy ending, but we learned a valuable lesson.